Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States by Almond Wheeler Lauber, PhD. Again, this is Studies in History, Economics and Public Law, edited by the Faculty of Political Science of Columbia University. The state of unrest caused by the Coureurs Des Bois and others stirring up the tribes in order to take captives for sale to the French as slaves interfered with the success of the trading corporation then in possession of Louisiana. And on October 25, 1720, the Company of the Indies issued a command from Paris stating that such action was contrary to the command of the king and harmful to both the commercial welfare of the company and the establishments which it hoped to make in the territory of the Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas tribes. The Sieur de Bourgmont, in the service of the company in that area, was directed to arrest and confiscate the merchandise of the voyagers who should come to trade within the confines of his jurisdiction without first obtaining permission and declaring to him the motives with which they wished to trade. All right, so before we continue, just wanted to mention what they said about the Coureurs Des Bois causing trouble, all right, and basically endangering their company, their business there. All right, these Coureurs Des Bois were the so-called fur traders. You see, they talk about like in the movie The Revenant and all that. So I just want to read a little bit about them. These were really basically not just fur traders, but they were also slavers. They were enslaving Indians. We're going to read that further on. All right, so now we're in this article written, it says here from the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. All right, it says leading the father, the Pawnee homeland, Coureurs Des Bois, in the Villas Shore expedition of 1720 by Christopher Steinke, University of New Mexico. All right, and we're going all the way to page 7 of this article, and it's about Coureurs Des Bois and the slave trade on the grasslands. All right. After hearing the reports by the Palomas and Cortalejos in 1719, Governor Valverde was reluctant to admit any Pawnee initiative in the attacks on the Apaches. Instead, he blamed enterprising French traders who seemingly could convince the Pawnees to invade New Mexico. Valverde had other reasons to fear a French invasion. France had seized Pensacola and claimed part of Texas following the outbreak of the War of the Quadruple Alliance, which started in 1718. In the same year, the ambitious companies, the Indies, gained control of French Louisiana. Although the company directors were much more interested in trade with New Mexico than war, they sought to open trade route to New Mexico by lining it with French allies, including the Apaches. Yet Indian nations in the eastern plains did not cooperate with this French scheme. French officials shared Valverde's belief that Coureurs Des Bois were really the ones behind the Pawnee, Osage, and Wichita attacks on the Apaches. According to the theory, these unregulated traders provoked endless wars in the plains by encouraging Pawnees to raid Apaches for slaves. The slave trade, more than anything else, sabotaged the larger commercial ambitions of the companies, the Indies, by earning the French the continued enmity of the Apaches. All right, so we read in the other book that these Coureurs Des Bois were basically instigating fights between the tribes, right? So they can enslave the prisoners, all right, and sell them to their French settlements, colonies, and English settlements. All right, so it's verifying you here that French officials shared Valverde's belief that the Coureurs Des Bois were really the ones behind the Pawnee, Osage, and Wichita attacks on the Apaches. All right. The company preoccupation with the slave trade raises questions about its size and relative importance in the 18th century Great Plains. All right, who are these Coureurs Des Bois? How big are they? How important were they in the 18th century in the Great Plains in this slave trade? Markets in Louisiana and New Mexico created a demand for slaves that plain Indians were attempting to satisfy as early as 1706. When Ulubari noted that Apaches and Pawnees were raiding each other to sell captives to the Spaniards and French, respectively, among Indian nations in the eastern plains, only the powerful Osages seemed immune from the retaliatory cycles of slave raiding. Practically no Osage captives appeared in French settlements in the Illinois country. Pawnees were less fortunate. Osage seized so many Pawnee and Wichita captives that they may have adopted a matrilocal household organization from their Caddoan enemies, and traders delivered enough Pawnee slaves to French markets in the Illinois country. Traders. Slave traders. The Pays d'en Haut in Canada, that Pawnees became the French term for any Indian slave originating from the west of the Mississippi. You hear that? It was a general adjective or description, right? It wasn't a certain tribe. Like eventually it became a term for any Indian slave originating from west of the Mississippi, Pawnees. Although many of these slaves were not in fact Pawnees, but Indians from neighboring tribes, about 68% of the Indian slaves in French Canada who received Indian names in the documentation, over 2,000 appear as Pawnees. All right, but they were from other tribes. The great purpose of the French in the New World was trade. All right, trade. All right, but we're starting to realize it was basically slave trade. Not just the word trade like we're thinking, oh, they were trading fur, spices, fruits, whatever. No, it was human cargo, slave trade. All right, they're leaving a word out of this. Their expeditions, excluding those of the missionaries, were commercial in nature. Commercial, key words here. With them, gold hunting was not a primary consideration. They didn't care about gold. Like I told you in the other videos, you are the gold. You are the commodity. You are. In their eyes, you were the slave. As was the case with the Spaniards. All right, so remember, the Spaniards didn't care about gold. They they wanted all this gold. Yeah, they took it. But they were making more prosperous, enslaving you and making you work for free to build their colonies and build their European cities over there. Nor were they seeking a refuge from persecution like the English. The great fur trade was being developed by them. This trade was carried on with the Indians, and in all sections where captives in war or kidnapped Indians were purchased from the natives. Such purchase was usually a part of the trade in furs. The custom of purchasing Indians originated with the early explorers and discoverers. Purchasing Indians. We ain't talking about Africans being purchased here. Sometimes such a purchase was made for a purely commercial reason, to obtain a slave to perform some certain labor. At other times, the buyer was moved by a humanitarian motive, to save an Indian from torture or death at the hands of his captors. Yeah, sure. The purchased Indian might then be allowed to return to his own tribe and be retained as a slave at the will of his new master. In 1678, Du Lhut, when setting out from Montreal on his travels westward, bought an Indian to act as a guide. Dutisne in 1719 similarly acquired some slaves from a chief at Natchitoches. In 1724, the Bourgmont purchased a considerable number of slaves from the Kansas tribe. Mention is made of 15 at one time, 6 at another. For these he was forced to pay double price, as the Indians stated that year before a Frenchman had given such a price to a party of Illinois who were with them. Sometimes the slaves obtained by these explorers and traders were used in their own expeditions. At other times, they were sent back to the settlement along with other merchandise. De Bourgmont sent some of those whom he purchased back to New Orleans. La Vérendrye also in 1731 sent back slaves to French settlements, and in writing of his action implied that he thought he deserved much credit for furnishing the colonists with slaves. All right, so Again, all these slaves, they're not African. The French are enslaving your ancestors. Until well into the latter half of the 18th century, Indian slaves were held by the settlers of Detroit, who obtained them in trade with friendly Indians, who in turn took them in war with the Pawnee, Osage, Choctaw, and other western tribes. All right, Indian slaves were held in Detroit, all right, who obtained them again in trade with friendly Indians, who in turn took them in war with the Pawnee, Osage, Choctaw, and other western tribes. In 1741, the so-called Nation of the Serpent entirely destroyed 17 villages, killed all the men and older women, made slaves of the young women, and traded them for horses and other merchandise. A report to the home government in 1720 concerning Nachitoches declared that the most extensive commerce which could be carried on with the Indians of that section would be in slaves, horses, skins, etc. Okay, so again, the French were here mainly for trade, and their venture was mainly commercial purposes, and the primary thing helping this was slaves, American Indian slavery, workforce, free labor. Another report sent by Lascelles told of the Alabama Indians bringing 27 or 28 mobile Indian women and children into the colony and disposing of them to the French. All right, so it's unfortunate to hear how the ancestors were enslaving each other. A lot of the times, I mean, there was past wars, of course, between them, but also just for survival. They wanted, they're trying to survive, and so that was the only way, really, that the few can really conquer the mass, right? We helped, they had help, and still today they're getting help. The friendly and allied Indians appreciated the results to be obtained from the sale of their captives to the whites, and not only sold them to the Coureurs Des Bois and other traveling traders, but took them directly to the French settlement for sale, as is shown in the preceding paragraph. So can you imagine in these times, all these, this was a big hustle. Like, think about it, man. All right, so you got, I'm like, really think about it, right? So you got these American Indians, right? So-called Negroes, right? With their fur coats on because they were doing fur trade, right? They're chilling. They got money. They're in the trade business, and they're over here selling people, your own people. All right. It's unfortunate again that this happened, but what can we learn from this? All right. Can we unite now? All right. Apparently, all the leading French settlements afforded a ready market for such slaves. Again, apparently, all the leading French settlements, all right, afforded a ready market for such slaves. All these French colonies, settlements in America were basically taking in American Indian slaves. Mostly not Africans. Show us the African records. All right, there is a real history being told here and recorded. Mobile furnishes a case in point. On November 1706, a party of Wacha, Wacha, or Wakanda arrived in the settlement, bringing some Abenaki captives for sale. In the same month, also some Choctaw brought to the settlement Kawita and Altamaha captives for the same purpose. All right, so everybody was in the game. That was the game at the time. Everybody, whether it was for survival or whatever, but a lot of the tribes were doing it to each other. Continues, says it was the Jesuit and French missionaries who first advocated the purchase of Indian captives by the traders in order to prevent their being put to death by putting them in a mild condition of servitude. They hoped to place them in a position where they would be Christianized. Again, servitude. Both Tonti and Lassalle advised such a course of action. The colonists favored the same action for a more commercial reason. The French of Kaskaskia in 1708 were urging the allied Indians to war and were on the spot to obtain captives to sell as slaves to the English. De Vaudreuil, Governor General of Canada, throughout the first quarter of the 18th century was urging the Abenaki to wage war on the Illinois to obtain slaves for him. An important factor in the French colonial trade was the Coureurs des Bois, the Bois. These men, having cut loose from civilization, wandered at will among the Indians, trading for the various commodities which they could dispose of in the settlements of either the French or English colonies. All right, so they say trade. We got to have the open quotes, close quotes, trade. Right, they were basically slavers. Most of them. That was the real hustle. That was the real, like in today, that would be the money. All right, one of these commodities was Indian slaves. Okay, one of these commodities is the major commodity. You are the gold, obtained for the most part from the tribes who had captured them in war. Judging from the number of these white men of the woods, their unrestrained life, and the evidence given by the men of the time, it seems not unlikely that this feature of colonial trade produced a considerable portion of Indian slaves used by the French. If the Coureurs des Bois did not find a sufficient number of slaves among the tribes they visited, they not infrequently stirred up the tribes to war so that they might obtain the captives for sale. You see what they were doing? So there's a group of people. Their main job was to go get slaves, and when they couldn't find any, or anybody was in war, and they would create wars. All right, they would create the problem, then they would bring their solution, which was to enslave you. All right, you, not Africans, you. On July 25th, 1707, LaSalle wrote from Fort Louis to the Minister of Marine that the Coureurs des Bois from Canada were thus stirring up the Indian tribes against each other in order to obtain Indian slaves to sell in Louisiana. The work of the Coureurs des Bois was, however, by no means limited to Louisiana, but extended over all the area claimed by the French. So they're saying Coureurs des Bois. Now, how many people is this? Who were they? This is a really this is a really general description of obviously more than one person. We're talking about a large group of people doing this all over the area claimed by the French, which was pretty huge. We know that, right? The desire of the English for Indian slaves afforded an opportunity for profit that could not be rejected. All right, so English plantations, right? And they were getting them from these Coureurs des Bois, French, Europeans, and also other American Indian traders, right? Again, none of these were African. They always found a ready market for their Indian slaves with the English of the Carolina country. The control of the French officials over this wandering class was always slight, and since there was practically no export trade in Indians to be had in Louisiana, and since all the Indians whom they obtained could not be disposed of in the colony, they turned to the English colonies for the purpose. The English what? Plantation. They definitely needed slaves in these plantations, right? Right? Cotton, sugar plantations. We know the stories, right? Of slavery. Where were they getting their supply? Their workforce? From American Indian slaves. All right? Let's wake up. Some effort was made by the French officials to prevent this trade, but the attempt met with indifferent success. They didn't stop. It was successful. business, commerce going on, enslaving your ancestors to the plantations. It was not the traffic in human beings which disturbed them, but the fact that their enemy, the English, were profiting by transaction. So they didn't care about you getting enslaved because they were doing it. They were taking advantage of that. They just cared that their rivals, the English, wouldn't get, too powerful in that region, have too much success. That's what they were worried about. They didn't care about you. In 1714, a report of Cadillac to the home government lamented both his inability to restrain the French allied Indians from trading with the English in slaves and other commodities, and also his embarrassment at not being able to prevent the French colonists from trading with the English in skins and Indian slaves. You hear all this, right? Real history. Such opposition, however, was not general among the French colonial officials. Some of the most prominent ones were engaged in this same slave trade with the English. Again, these French colonial officials, the most prominent ones, were actually engaged in this same slave trade, the American Indian slave trade. With who? With the English. Both of them enslaving American Indians. They're not getting them from Africa. And when appearing to be opposed to it, in 1708, Bienville ordered the Canadian French to cease exciting the Indians of Kaskaskia to wage war on each other to obtain slaves for them. Yet in the same year, he proposed, since the French would not cultivate the land, to obtain the needful supply of labor by seizing Indians and sending them to the West Indies in exchange for Negroes or other American Indians. Keyword, they say Negroes, right? They don't say Africans. And in his report to the home government, mentioned above, Cadillac complained of the selling of Indian slaves to the English by Bienville. Such transactions by the French officials were carried on secretly. The slave trade had evidently become enough of a problem in the plains by the late 1710s that French officials identified it as their primary obstacle to commercial and political expansion. In 1717, Francois de Lemarie, a priest who had served for nearly a decade in the settlement of Mobile, composed a memoir on Louisiana in which he recommended that the French crown outlaw the Indian slave trade in the Great Plains. It was so major, it was affecting so much what was going on, right? They wanted to control it, really. That's what they really wanted to do, right? So they wanted to outlaw it supposedly because it was so major, right? Indian slave trade this is not Africans. Again, Indian slave trade. He specifically condemned those Coureurs Des Bois, the Coureurs Des Bois, like Poudret, who bought and sold slaves of Paducas and other peoples of the Missouri. A ban on the slave trade would, he concluded, cut at the root the wars that the Indians only continue between themselves because of the advantageous sale that they make of their captives to the traders, who then resell them in this colony to the Spanish and to the vessels that come to our port for selling them a third time to the islands. All right, who were they giving the Spanish, and who was going to these islands in the West Indies? American Indians, not Africans. All right, there was a whole circle of slave trade, right? We're starting to see, right? Is it starting to add up to you? The directors of the Compagnie des Indes, monitoring their unprofitable colony from Paris and hoping to open the New Mexico trade through the Paducas, eventually heeded Le Marier's call for a ban on the slave trade. All right, so remember in the other book we read the ban, right? But it didn't have no effect, really. Let's see what it says here. In late October 1720, they ordered Governor Bienville to end the Indian slave trade. Bienville, right? We got him on the other book, right? Along the Missouri and Arkansas rivers because the raiding for captives inhibited trade across the plains. They complained that voyagers were fomenting war between Indian nations in order to procure slaves. All right? They were instigating wars This was not only contrary to the orders of the king, but very harmful to the well-being of the company's commerce. The directors concluded, but officials in Louisiana largely opposed this plan. In the Illinois country, Boyce Bryant worried that a ban on the Apache slave trade would alienate Pawnees with cheetahs and Osages, and that the Pawnees would continue raiding and simply sell their captives to Fox people, who could destroy the Illinois country. He concluded that the French were stuck between two options: a dangerous Pawnee-Fox alliance or an alliance with Pawnees against Apaches, who would then block trade with New Mexico. While the director of the Compagnie de les Indes believed that an end to the slave trade would secure peace in the plains, they overestimated the influence of slave trading Coureurs Des Bois. They overestimated the influence of slave trading Coureurs Des Bois on Pawnee chiefs. Pawnees were not raiding Cortalejo and Paloma Apaches simply to meet a demand for slaves. Instead, these Apaches occupied lands that Pawnees wanted to use for themselves, bison ranges and river valleys in the western plains. Some opposition to the trade was shown by the Jesuits, since the hope for result of having numbers of slaves to convert, if purchased by the French, did not materialize. Accordingly, in 1693, they petitioned the governor of Canada to prohibit the trade in Indian slaves. The request was granted in an order issued to that effect, but without definite result. The Coureurs Des Bois continued the trade in spite of the penalty of fine and imprisonment. It didn't do anything to change the outcome. The American Indian slavery continued hundreds of years. Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States. Again, we're in chapter 3 and we're talking about the French's involvement in enslaving the American Indians. It says here the Indians realized that the trade in captive slaves was profitable. It was profitable to you. You're a hustler, right? So you helped. When in 1724 the Kansas tribe charged the Bourgmont double price for slaves sold him, they feared that he would be angry at the price asked, and that in consequence they would lose future trade. So they presented him with 5 slaves as a gift. The relation of the French and the Indians, bond or free, was always different from that existing between the English and the Indians. The Frenchmen never looked upon the Indians with the disdain and contempt for an inferior race which was displayed by the English. Well, not all of them, right? Marriage between French and Indians was common. All right, so marriage between French and Indians. All right, so not Africans, slaves, right? Because then we know about what they start saying, mulattoes, right? And how, these French colonies, the French were marrying with the slave girls who are supposed to be, right, African descendants, but they were really marrying so-called Negro girls, right? But they were Indians. So marriage between French and Indians was common. The social result of these close connections was more pronounced in case of the Frenchman than in that of the Indian. It meant that Indianizing of the Frenchman, or the bringing him to the social level, into the life and habits of the red man. He took on your ways, copper-colored tribe. The most striking result of this tendency was supplied by the Coureurs Des Bois, but the same result was apparent even in the case of the superior colonists of Lower Louisiana. And to this result, the Indian slave contributed in a measure. The lack of social distinction between Frenchman and native tended toward kind treatment on the part of the owner, into a shifting of the social planes of master and slave toward that of equality. Yet instances of cruelty to slaves are not lacking. All right, so just because some of them were doing it, or most of them were marrying, or whatever, cruelty to slaves was not lacking. The punishment of the age were cruel, whether the offender was bond or free. It has been said that the dominating feature of French colonial life was trade, but religious and commercial advancement went hand in hand. From the earliest arrival of the French, the missionary labors of the church extended not only to the Indian tribes, but also to the Negro and Indian slaves held by the colonists. The conversion of the Indian was an asset for the growth of trade. It was an asset to make you Christian, for the growth of what? trade. What? Slave trade. It has already been seen that the French missionaries of early colonial days believed that the enslavement of Indians would serve as means of spreading the Christian religion. They found, however, that the method of obtaining Indian slaves by trade only increased the distribution of spirituous liquors among the tribes. And so in 1693, they asked the king to prohibit the Indian slave trade. An order to this effect was accordingly issued, but with little result. The Coureurs Des Bois found means to carry on the trade. Clandestine, notwithstanding the penalty attached. Again in 1736, the king decided formally to prohibit the enslavement of Indians and issued a decree to that effect, but to no advantage. Again, this was Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States by Almond Wheeler Lauber. All right, Studies in the History, Economics, and Public Law, edited by the Faculty of Political Science of Columbia University.